Hey, church family. So, this is part 2 of our video series on just background information from the book of Hebrews, trying to answer some of the deeper questions behind the scenes that aren't as well fit for a Sunday morning discussion. So, part 1, I gave you a little bit of background as to the framework of the letter, the structure of the letter, some material. But this is the question everybody always asks about the book of Hebrews. Who wrote the letter of Hebrews? So we're going to dive in and really try to answer that question today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, and we have a list here. I've got 6 names for you that have all been recommended by reasonable voices from church history as potential authors of this really important New Testament book. And some of you have studied this before and heard some of these names as suggestions. It's interesting as I talk to people in the church, they have their preferences. And some really like to think of it like, yeah, this was a Paul letter, or this was Luke, or maybe this was Apollos, because Apollos is different and he didn't write a book of the Bible. So we're going to go through the 6 major options today and look at some of the positives and negatives of each of them. And we'll try to go through it pretty quickly. Obviously, the first option and the most popular option, because he's the most well-known New Testament author, is the Apostle Paul. Why would it be? What are the positive points for Pauline authorship? Number 1, he is the one that most people have guessed at. And he is the one that actually many in the early church assumed wrote the letter. Now, their reasons for making that assumption aren't always really clear or concrete. One of the interesting things about the book is if you look at chapter 13 or chapters 6 and 10, it becomes clear. The original audience of this book knew who wrote the letter. And yet, we don't know. And so that's a little bit surprising. So that's maybe a case in some people's minds for Paul, because Paul's the one that wrote a bunch of different letters. But throughout church history, the letters that have been written by Paul are pretty widely regarded as Paul's letters. And what's the big difference between Hebrews and those? Well, Hebrews is not named. And so that's a big point of against Paul. Though there's other points for Paul, such as the framework is similar, some of the vocabulary is similar themes that Paul talks about in his other letters, and the fact that Paul and the author of Hebrews had many of the same associates, such as Timothy, who's mentioned by name. So there are some reasons to think it makes sense for Paul to write the letter. There's some other reasons why it doesn't make sense. And this is pretty convincing to me. 4 reasons why I don't think Paul wrote the letter, and most people really don't believe that that is the case. Number 1, Hebrews is the only one of the letters considered that is anonymous. The other letters, Paul names himself. Why would he change that structure? There's not really a clear reason why. So, number 2 is that in Galatians 1, go back and read verse 1 of Galatians 1 and verses 11 through 17. What you'll see is Paul made it very clear. It was very important to him to say that the message of the gospel came to him firsthand. As an eyewitness, the road to Damascus, Paul throughout his ministry says, I saw Jesus. I'm a witness. I'm an apostle as a witness to Jesus. The author of Hebrews makes it clear he is not. Hebrews 2:3 says that the message of salvation came to the author of Hebrews secondhand. That would be very, very different than Paul's claims in Galatians 1 in particular, but other places as well. Number 3, why I don't think Paul wrote the letter, is whatever similarities are just Christian vocabulary. The similar themes of Hebrews and the other Pauline letters are just because the New Testament is about the gospel, and there's only so many themes about the gospel. So many of the overlap in content just makes sense that it's a book about the same God and the same message of the gospel. Number 4, there are significant thematic differences. Union with Christ is a huge theme in Paul's ministry and not in the book of Hebrews. Justification, huge theme in Paul's ministry, not the book of Hebrews. The resurrection of Jesus, huge theme in Paul's ministry, not in the book of Hebrews. What is unique to the book of Hebrews? The high priestly office of Jesus. That's the number 1 description of Jesus in the book of Hebrews. So much of it has to do with the ascension and the high priestly office and fulfilling the new covenant. Paul doesn't talk about Jesus as high priest in the same way in any of his other letters. And so this is something that really doesn't fit with the themes of the Apostle Paul in other areas. So if it's not Paul, who else might it be? Well, the best guess is that it's somebody that is a close associate of Paul because, as I said, Timothy is mentioned. So Timothy's number one, not an option for the author. But Paul knew Timothy really well. Lots of Paul's associates knew Timothy well. So what about another associate, co-worker of Paul? Luke has been one that's been widely suggested because Luke wrote two other books of the New Testament, the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts. So why couldn't Luke have potentially written Hebrews? Well, one of the reasons why we don't think Luke wrote Hebrews, which is another point against Paul, is when you have a letter from somebody, you can compare the grammar, the writing style, the vocabulary, and see there's enough differences between Luke and the book of Hebrews that it's really not likely. Any similarities is just because Luke, the only real case for Luke is he was a close associate of Paul, and we are fairly certain Luke, that the author of Hebrews was a close associate of Paul. So is Luke possible? Sure, I don't consider it likely. I don't think Luke is a better argument than, say, Silas or Epaphras, who have also been recommended, just not often. What are some other recommendations as possible authors? Clement of Rome, not mentioned in the New Testament, but an early Christian leader, an early church father. Some people have suggested Clement. John Calvin, as an example, suggested Clement, others throughout church history. The problem with Clement is he quotes from the book of Hebrews. And he quotes from the book of Hebrews as if it's scripture and not something that he himself wrote. So Clement's not really an option, although he's an important leader in the first century of the church. Another option, really popular, and one of my favorite people in the New Testament, Barnabas. Fits the bill as a close associate of Paul. Another reason for Barnabas is regarded as a Levite and an encourager. And the book of Hebrews identifies itself as a word of exhortation, a word of encouragement. So Barnabas is the son of encouragement. Paraklesis is the Greek word there. And the letter of Hebrews is a letter of encouragement. Paraklesis, the same word. Barnabas fits the bill in a sense. And yet, again, there's really not a lot of information there. Tertullian, who is an early church father, he was the first to recommend Barnabas because he felt like it fit as an associate of Paul, as somebody who was a Levite, who obviously knew Levites were the ones that the priests came out of the line of Levi. And so Levites knew all about the Old Covenant, all about the sacrificial system. It would make sense that a Levite like Barnabas would know a lot about the Old Covenant and be able to explain it in light of the gospel, which is one of the themes of the book of Hebrews. Also, my personal opinion, Barnabas is one of the most underappreciated figures in the New Testament. Barnabas was Paul's mentor. And most people don't realize that in the book of Acts. But for many years, Barnabas was the leader in the relationship between Paul and Barnabas. But at a certain point, Paul took a greater role in leadership and ministry and obviously wrote lots of the New Testament. Do I think Barnabas wrote it? No, I don't necessarily think we can make that case. I think Barnabas is a good option, but we certainly don't know. Tertullian, strong voice in the early church. He liked Barnabas as an option. I think that makes sense. Maybe not much more than some of these other options, though. Apollos, the next guest. Now, Martin Luther, another strong voice in church history, although 1,000 years after Tertullian, Martin Luther in the 16th century said, hey, Apollos makes sense. Now, did he have direct historical knowledge? No. He was writing 1,500 years after the book of Hebrews was written, but he liked Apollos because Apollos was an associate of Paul, was well read in the scriptures, was a teacher of the scriptures among the apostles, and Apollos had an important hometown. He was from Alexandria. And if you study the book of Hebrews along with Greek philosophy, you find this guy named Philo of Alexandria, who it seems like the book of Hebrews is interacting with some of the philosophy in the early writings of Philo of Alexandria. So it would make sense that Apollos, the Christian from Alexandria, would write the Christian letter that is interacting with the thought of Philo of Alexandria. So that's important to realize in the book of Hebrews. It's not just the Old Testament the author's interacting with, but the contemporary philosophy of Philo of Alexandria. So Apollos has kind of a strong case for that reason. Also, the Hebrews 13 speaks of those from Italy, which some people have said, well, those from Italy that are leading the church in Italy, and most likely the book of Hebrews is written to those in Italy, but Apollos clearly knew people in Italy like Priscilla and Aquila, other associates of Paul with whom Apollos was really close. In fact, Apollos was a really gifted teacher before he knew much about what he was talking about. And the book of Acts portrays in Acts 18 Priscilla and Aquila, husband and wife teaching combo, coming alongside Apollos and helping him understand the gospel of Christ better. And so there's a close association there. So maybe, Apollos, he wasn't an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, like Hebrews 2 says, the author of Hebrews wasn't. So that makes Barnabas and Apollos both really, really strong options. The last option that is super popular for a whole nother reason that is worth appreciating. Over the centuries of church history, Priscilla has been mentioned as a possibility. I just told you about who Aquila and Priscilla were. Aquila the man, Priscilla the wife, a husband and wife that taught, that were amongst the apostles that knew the scriptures well. And so there's a possibility that this would be the only New Testament book written by a female. And the fact that there's a woman author would be a really cool thing for women in the church. We know Priscilla, like Apollos, like Barnabas, knew Timothy. Timothy's mentioned by name. And we know she wasn't an eyewitness of the ministry of Jesus. She heard the gospel secondhand. And so it fits a lot of the qualifications. However, in Hebrews 11, there is a very clear male pronoun that is used by the author. So the author self-identifies himself as a man in at least one spot in the book of Hebrews. And so that would mean that if the author of Hebrews was a female author, it would be a deceptive practice. And some would say, well, in the first century, women didn't have the same rights, and that's why the argument for Priscilla that she kind of carefully wrote it, or she wrote it making people think that maybe Aquila and Priscilla wrote it together. Maybe it was team authored by Aquila and Priscilla. I don't believe that this book was written by a woman because the author identifies himself as a male. So, what are the best options? Apollos is a great option. Barnabas is a great option. Aquila is a great option, and maybe Priscilla had some role in it alongside Aquila. Epaphras, Silas, other associates of Paul. It's a very strong possibility that whoever wrote the book is named in the book of Acts, and probably as sort of a bit character, as somebody that isn't super prominent in the book of Acts, but is there with the Apostle Paul as somebody that is mentored by him, taught by him, and then writes the book to the church to strengthen the church and keep the church from falling back into Judaism. We know the author of Hebrews was known by the original audience, knew the trials of the original audience. In chapter 6 and 10, he has direct knowledge of what the church is going through. We know he knew the Old Covenant well. And we know he was a close associate of Paul and Timothy and that crowd in that century of the church. But we also know he was probably not Paul, and he did not see Jesus, was not one of the original 12 either, who were direct eyewitnesses of Jesus. So Peter has been recommended by some. Hebrews 2, for the same reason it would disqualify Paul, it would disqualify Peter as well. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? I don't know. But it's a beautiful book inspired by God that throughout church history has been regarded as an apostolic work. That means it's by one of the apostles or a close associate of the apostles. So that means that Paul probably didn't write it, but it was written by somebody who Paul vouched for, and the early church knew who it was, and it's okay. Origen, one of the early church fathers, said, only God knows who wrote the book of Hebrews. John Calvin basically said the same thing over 1,000 years later. We don't know, and that's okay, because ultimately, God wrote the book of Hebrews through a man that spoke by the Spirit of God to the early church and is now speaking to us. And it's a beautiful message for us to not leave behind the gospel for the sake of the old covenant, but to follow Jesus and trust in his high priestly ministry on our behalf. I hope that's helpful in answering some of our questions.